Flight attendant slaps a Blackman, not knowing he is the owner of the airline. Rebecca, a racist flight attendant, slaps a black man named Michael Carter, causing tension in the cabin to explode, not knowing he is the owner of the airline. As more passengers begin to reveal startling truths, her actions lead to consequences far beyond what she could have imagined. This confrontation would change not only her life, but also the lives of everyone on board. The morning sun streamed through the half-open blinds as Michael Carter dressed carefully in front of the mirror. Today was important. He straightened his tie, smoothing the fabric down the front of his tailored suit. His reflection showed a man in his prime, composed, successful, and focused. This trip wasn't just about business, it was personal. He was heading to an international summit where he'd be finalizing plans for a Black empowerment program that aimed to provide scholarships and entrepreneurial resources to underserved communities. It was the culmination of years of hard work, and everything needed to go perfectly. Michael double-checked his briefcase, slipping in some final papers and the presentation he'd been working on late into the night. His driver was waiting downstairs, the familiar hum of the town car's engine filling the quiet street. As he stepped out of his brownstone, a crisp autumn breeze hit him, cool against his skin. The neighborhood bustled with life, street vendors setting up shop, families out for morning walks. But Michael's mind was already on the flight, the meeting, and the changes he hoped to bring. The drive to the airport was smooth, the city streets falling away as they merged onto the highway. Michael leaned back in his seat, scrolling through emails on his phone, reviewing notes for the summit. His assistant had handled most of the logistics as usual, but there was something uniquely energizing about traveling for such an important cause. He imagined the faces of the young men and women who would benefit from the program. This wasn't just a business trip. It was a step toward giving them the opportunities he himself had fought so hard for. As the car pulled into the airport's private terminal, Michael nodded to his driver before heading inside. He traveled often, and even as the owner of a large airline, he preferred to keep a low profile. He had deliberately avoided plastering his name across headlines, choosing instead to invest his efforts quietly. His role as owner was not highly publicized on purpose, ensuring he could move about without unnecessary attention. It was how he liked it. No fanfare, no spectacle, just results. He entered the terminal and after clearing security, made his way to the gate. His phone buzzed with updates from the team managing the Black Empowerment project, but Michael remained focused. Today wasn't about him. It was about the people he was helping. Still, the flight ahead gave him time to mentally prepare for the conference. Michael sat back in his seat, trying to settle in, though he could feel the tension crawling under his skin. His eyes flicked to the windows, taking in the clean lines of the airport's tarmac, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He had faced this before. The stares, the doubt, the unspoken question that hovered over every interaction. What are you doing here? It was exhausting, the way people assumed he didn't belong. No matter how much success he achieved, no matter how many businesses he ran, or how much he gave back to his community, all some people saw was his skin. They never asked about his work, his legacy, or the lives he touched. For people like the air hostess, he was just a black man who must have gotten lucky, or, worse, cheated his way into first class. He shifted in his seat, rolling his shoulders to release the tension building in his neck. He didn't want to dwell on it. He had bigger things to focus on. The empowerment program was what mattered. The opportunity to change lives, to create a lasting impact. But the air hostess's lingering stares kept pulling him back to the present. Her hostility as clear as the midday sun. Why does it always have to be this way? He thought. Across the cabin, the air hostess, Rebecca, watched him closely. Something about him irked her in a way she couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the confidence he exuded as he took his seat in first class, like he owned the place. It rubbed her the wrong way. First-class passengers were supposed to be distinguished, the kind who exuded wealth and success in a way that felt familiar to her. They were the kind of people who matched her image of luxury, polished, refined, and white. But this man, he didn't fit that picture. He was black. Rebecca bit the inside of her cheek, her thoughts spiraling. Who does he think he is? She wondered. It wasn't just his skin. There was something about his presence that unnerved her. The quiet authority in the way he carried himself, the way he barely acknowledged her, as if he didn't need to. She told herself it was nothing personal. It was just an instinct she had. She'd worked first class long enough to know when someone didn't quite belong. She glanced around the cabin. The usual passengers, business executives, affluent retirees, occasional celebrities, fit neatly into the categories she was used to. But him, there was no way he was in first class without some mistake. Rebecca's mind raced through possible scenarios. Maybe he was using someone else's ticket, or maybe it was some kind of affirmative action, a charity case the airline didn't tell her about. The idea irritated her even more. No one gets to just walk in here without earning it, she thought bitterly. Rebecca's thoughts tangled further. She had worked hard to get where she was, climbing the ranks of cabin crew with an unyielding work ethic. She had earned her place in the skies, serving the world's elite. And yet, here he was, sitting in her first class, making her feel displaced. The thought gnawed at her. Michael, still silent, glanced at her again. He could see the way she looked at him, like he was out of place, an intruder in her world. He had seen it too many times to count. In restaurants, at business meetings, even at his own boardroom table. There were always those who looked at him like he didn't belong. And despite all he had achieved, despite owning his own airline, here he was, just another black man being silently scrutinized for occupying a space others didn't think he deserved. She doesn't know who I am, Michael thought, shaking his head slightly. But does it even matter? To people like her, his name wouldn't change her opinion. She had already judged him. It wasn't the lack of recognition that bothered him. It was that, even if she knew her contempt would only shift to a new flavor of disbelief, a black man owning an airline, she'd probably think it was a joke. Still, Michael's pulse quickened, not with anger, but with a tired kind of frustration. He didn't need this now. Not before such an important meeting. He had worked too hard to let someone like her distract him from his purpose. But the air around him felt thick with her silent judgment, and it made it hard to relax. Rebecca, still standing by the cabin door, caught herself staring again and quickly busied herself with trivial tasks. She rearranged the overhead bins, checked the champagne inventory, all while her mind churned with indignation. She could feel her face growing warm with a mix of discomfort and resentment. She wasn't racist, she told herself. This was about maintaining the standard of first class, of luxury, of exclusivity. But deep down, she knew that wasn't entirely true. Her gaze flicked back to Michael. He's out of place, her mind insisted. But the truth was, something deeper was simmering, something she didn't want to acknowledge. The idea of a black man sitting there, with more confidence than the wealthy passengers she typically served, unsettled her. He didn't ask for permission to belong, he just was. And that was something she wasn't used to. As the minutes ticked by, the tension built. Rebecca's thoughts tangled with each passing glance, and Michael's patience wore thin. He could feel the weight of her eyes every time she walked past, her subtle sneers barely hidden beneath her forced professionalism. He could hear the unspoken words in the silence. You don't belong here. But this wasn't new for him. He had always known how to rise above it, how to stay calm in the face of prejudice. Still, as the minutes passed, he couldn't help but wonder how far this would go. Would she say something? Do something? The thought made him sigh inwardly. And Rebecca, she couldn't stop herself now. Each time she passed him, her frustration mounted. She didn't even know why she felt this strongly, but something about him sitting there, so sure of himself, made her blood boil. Maybe he'll slip up, she thought. Maybe then I can put him in his place. But she had no idea who she was dealing with. The plane had been taxiing for a few minutes, but the air in the first-class cabin remained thick with tension. Michael shifted in his seat, trying to get comfortable, though the weight of Rebecca's stares never left him. He decided to focus on his laptop, reviewing notes for the summit. Just stay calm, he reminded himself, typing away with deliberate focus. Rebecca, meanwhile, was fuming inside. Every time she glanced his way, her discomfort grew. It gnawed at her, that sense of something wrong. She couldn't explain it, but her thoughts kept circling back to him. Why is he here? Her irritation simmered, bubbling beneath her carefully controlled exterior. As Rebecca moved through the aisle, checking on the other passengers, she approached Michael's seat again. Her steps were slower this time, her attention drawn to him almost involuntarily. In her frustration, she wasn't paying close attention when she passed by, and Michael, distracted, reached up to adjust the air vent above him. Their movements collided. Her arm brushed against his hand in a brief, awkward contact. That was it. The moment snapped something inside her. Without thinking, without processing, Rebecca's body acted on pure instinct. Her hand shot out, a sharp crack ringing through the cabin as her palm connected with Michael's face. Michael's head snapped to the side from the impact, his skin stinging, the sound of the slap hanging in the air. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. He sat in stunned silence, blinking as the sensation of the slap registered fully. His cheek burned, but it was the deeper hurt that took hold, an old, familiar ache that went beyond the physical pain. He had been slapped before, not literally, but in ways that left invisible scars. The slap wasn't just an attack on him, it was an attack on everything he had worked for, everything he represented. It wasn't just because of the misunderstanding, it was because he was a black man in her eyes, who had dared to exist in her space. His chest tightened as memories of a lifetime of prejudice flooded back. All the times he'd been made to feel less than, all the silent judgments he had learned to endure. But this was different. This was a public humiliation, a blatant act of violence, and it cut deeper than any words could. Michael's jaw clenched, his eyes dark with a mix of pain and quiet fury. He couldn't believe this was happening. Not now. Not here. Rebecca stood there, frozen, her hand still hovering in the air. The weight of what she had done hit her like a tidal wave, crashing down with overwhelming force. Her eyes widened in horror, her breath catching in her throat. Oh my God. What had she done? She hadn't meant to. She didn't plan to hit him. It just happened. But the reality of it was undeniable, staring her in the face with the mark of her palm on Michael's cheek. For the first time, the roles were reversed, and she felt out of place, out of control. Her chest tightened, shame rising in her like a flood, drowning the defensiveness she'd clung to. The other passengers had noticed. The entire cabin had fallen into a shocked hush, eyes wide, mouths slightly agape. She could feel their judgment, cold and sharp like knives cutting through her. The cabin froze after the slap, a shocked silence hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. Then, all at once, the murmurs began, rising like an approaching storm. Did he just... A middle-aged man sitting a row back squinted in disbelief, looking between Michael and Rebecca. What's going on? Someone else whispered. The air was thick with tension, passengers craning their necks, trying to piece together what had happened. Rebecca, still standing there with her hand hovering in disbelief, felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her. Panic surged through her chest, and before she could stop herself, she lashed out defensively. "He touched me!" she blurted, her voice trembling but insistent. I had to defend myself. He grabbed me." A few heads nodded slightly in Rebecca's direction, their gazes shifting toward Michael with uncertainty. A man in a business suit near the front frowned, his brows furrowing in suspicion. "Are you sure?" he asked, glancing at Rebecca as if to give her the benefit of the doubt. If she says he did it, why would she lie? On the other side, a young black woman with a strong, unwavering presence stood up from her seat, glaring at the flight attendant. That's not true. You just slapped him because he's black and in first class. I saw the whole thing. You were already tense the moment you noticed him. The businessman next to her raised his hands, shaking his head in confusion. Let's not jump to conclusions. We don't know what happened yet. Another passenger chimed in, uncertain but empathetic toward Rebecca. Maybe she panicked. Anyone could have reacted that way if they thought they were being grabbed. The murmurs swelled into low arguments, people leaning over seats, their voices rising in conflicting waves. "She's lying!" one passenger exclaimed, while another retorted, "You don't know that! Maybe he did do something!" Michael sat still, absorbing the chaos, his jaw clenched tightly. The sting of the slap was still fresh on his cheek, but the sting of the accusations hurt more. His mind raced, replaying the moment, wondering how things had escalated so quickly. His heart sank as he caught snippets of the passengers' divided opinions. A man in a blue polo shirt shook his head in disappointment. Why would she slap him if he didn't do anything? She must have felt threatened. But the young woman who had defended him from the beginning wouldn't let it slide. Threatened? Please. You all saw how she was looking at him the moment he boarded. She's just upset a black man is sitting in first class. Another man, seated closer to the front, turned around, frustration in his voice. That's a serious accusation. We don't know if this was about race. The arguments continued to build, dividing the cabin. Some passengers looked at Michael with sympathy, while others eyed him with suspicion. Michael could feel the weight of their judgment on his shoulders. It was happening again, the same prejudices, the same assumptions. For being black, for daring to sit where some people thought he didn't belong. And then, as if the pressure of it all became too much, a voice cut through the tension, quiet but steady. I have to say something. It was the woman in the casual sweater, her voice trembling as she stood, wringing her hands nervously. Her face was pale, and her eyes darted between Rebecca and Michael. I saw what happened. It's my fault. All eyes turned to her now. Rebecca's mouth opened in surprise, confusion flashing across her face. "I'm sorry," the woman continued, her voice thick with guilt. "I was trying to get your attention, miss," she said to Rebecca. "You were distracted, and you brushed against him. But he didn't touch you. It was an accident, and I should have said something before. I didn't mean for things to get this bad." The cabin went still again. The businessman who had questioned Michael's innocence shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The woman who had defended Michael earlier crossed her arms, glaring at Rebecca. "So, you slapped him for nothing," she said flatly, her voice full of righteous anger. Rebecca blinked, her mouth dry. I thought..." Her voice cracked under the pressure of her own realization. "I didn't mean..." Another passenger leaned forward, shaking his head. "You just jumped to conclusions because he's black, didn't you?" The murmurs changed tone, passengers now turning on Rebecca. Michael remained seated, silent, his gaze locked on the floor as the atmosphere around him shifted from suspicion to judgment, but this time toward Rebecca. The air was thick with tension as the truth settled in, and passengers exchanged uncomfortable looks, their voices dropping to uneasy murmurs. Rebecca's face paled, her chest tightening with guilt and shame. Her hands trembled as she looked at Michael, struggling to form the words for an apology. But before she could say anything, she turned abruptly and hurried down the aisle, needing to escape the judgmental eyes of the passengers. She disappeared into the crew's private area, her retreat unnoticed by most, but Michael saw. He noticed the weight on her shoulders, the visible crack in her confidence. In the quiet that followed, Michael took a slow breath, feeling the burn of the slap still lingering on his cheek, but letting it fade, not just physically, but in his heart. He straightened in his seat, maintaining his composure despite the whirlwind of emotions around him. He had been through enough to know that anger would only fan the flames. The woman in the casual sweater approached him slowly, eyes full of remorse, her voice shaky. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, wringing her hands. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I was just trying to get her attention, and I never thought it would turn into this." Michael turned to her, his gaze soft but steady. He could see the guilt eating away at her. "It's okay," he said quietly, his voice calm and soothing. "You didn't cause this. It was a misunderstanding, that's all." "But I should have spoken up sooner," the woman continued, her voice breaking. "You didn't deserve that. None of this should have happened." Michael gave a small, understanding smile, gently shaking his head. "Sometimes things happen that are out of our control," he said, his tone compassionate. "What matters is how we handle it afterward, and you did the right thing by speaking up. That takes courage." The woman's eyes welled with tears, and she nodded gratefully. She hadn't expected such grace after what had unfolded. As the tension in the cabin began to ease, a ripple of curiosity spread through the passengers. They had seen Michael's calm demeanor throughout the ordeal, and now whispers began to circulate. Who was this man who handled such a humiliating moment with such dignity? A stewardess who hadn't been part of the earlier confrontation approached cautiously, her eyes widening as she looked at the manifest. She paused, blinking several times as if processing what she was seeing. Then, her face flushed with realization, and she hurried over to Michael, nearly stumbling over her words. "Sir," she stammered, I'm so sorry for the misunderstanding." Her voice dropped to a whisper, as if the weight of the moment was pressing down on her shoulders. We didn't recognize you earlier, but you're the owner of this airline." At those words, the cabin fell into a stunned silence. Passengers who had been murmuring among themselves about the confrontation now stopped mid-sentence, their gazes snapping back to Michael with a mix of awe and disbelief. "The owner?" A man near the front gasped, turning to look at Michael with wide eyes. Michael nodded gently, unfazed by the revelation, but acutely aware of the shift in the cabin's energy. "Yes," he said, his voice calm as ever. "I am." The realization spread like wildfire. A woman sitting a few rows back, who had been glaring at Rebecca, now looked at Michael in astonishment. "I can't believe this," she muttered, shaking her head in disbelief. "He owns the whole airline?" Passengers exchanged looks, some embarrassed for doubting him, others ashamed for not speaking up sooner. The man in the business suit, who had initially given Rebecca the benefit of the doubt, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding eye contact with anyone. A young man sitting across the aisle, who had remained quiet until now, leaned forward, staring at Michael with newfound respect. "I didn't realize who you were," he said softly, his tone filled with admiration. "But the way you handled this, man, you didn't deserve any of it." Michael simply nodded. No one should ever be judged by what they look like. We all deserve respect. There was a hush as the weight of his words sank in. Passengers glanced at one another, some nodding in agreement, others visibly uncomfortable with how things had played out. The air felt different now, less tense, more reflective. One by one, the passengers began to understand that this moment was about more than just a slap or a misunderstanding. It was a mirror held up to their own judgments and assumptions. And now, faced with Michael's dignity and composure, they felt the weight of their own complicity in the tension that had built up. Rebecca stood in the galley, her heart pounding in her chest, the cold steel counter digging into her back as she leaned against it. Her hands shook slightly as she tried to steady herself, but it was no use. The adrenaline from the confrontation still coursed through her veins, but now it was accompanied by an overwhelming wave of regret. She stared at the reflection in the metal surface, her face pale, her lips trembling. What have I done? The slap had been instinctive, fueled by a combination of panic, prejudice, and the confusion of the moment. But the realization that she had struck an innocent man, not just any man, but her boss, was a nightmare unraveling in real time. She took a deep breath, trying to control the nausea rising in her throat, but it wasn't just the act that haunted her. It was the look on his face, the collective stares from the passengers, every judgmental gaze that now weighed her down like 100 stones. How could I be so blind? She moved to step out of the galley, but her legs felt heavy, as though they might buckle under her. Her thoughts spiraled, the full weight of her actions settling in. She had acted on prejudice, on fear, and in doing so, she had revealed the worst parts of herself, not just to Michael, but to everyone on that flight. Her stomach churned as she remembered the passengers' reactions immediately after the slap. Some had gasped in shock, others murmured under their breath. A woman near the front had covered her mouth in disbelief, and Rebecca could see the disgust etched on her face. Others had outright glared at her, their eyes full of condemnation. She'd never felt so small, so utterly trapped in a situation of her own making. As she finally gathered the courage to take a step forward, she could hear the whispers spreading through the cabin like wildfire. The buzz of judgment, of disapproval filled the air, stinging her with every second. "You've ruined everything," she thought bitterly, her throat tight as she walked slowly back toward the cabin. "This is your career, your reputation, and you just threw it away." Worse, she swallowed hard. You hurt him. Every step was excruciating. Her legs felt as though they were trudging through thick mud, her feet dragging with the weight of her guilt. The stares from the passengers felt like daggers. Some of them still whispered, eyes narrowing as she passed. Rebecca wanted to disappear, to escape this moment, but she couldn't. She had to face it, face him, the man she had wronged so terribly. She kept her head down, every step toward Michael feeling like she was being dragged toward her own execution. Her mind raced with the possible consequences. Disciplinary action, termination, public humiliation. But none of that compared to the shame burning in her chest. When she reached his seat, the words stuck in her throat. Michael sat there, calm and composed, his presence filling the space with a quiet dignity that only deepened the guilt gnawing at her insides. Rebecca felt even smaller now, standing before him. She couldn't bring herself to look him in the eye. Behind her, she could still feel the cabin's collective judgment pressing down on her. The businessman in row 4 had openly scoffed when she'd walked past, shaking his head in disbelief. A mother in the back had shot her a withering glare, clutching her daughter's hand as if to shield her from the ugliness of what had just transpired. "She's lucky she didn't get fired on the spot," someone whispered harshly. "Honestly, it's disgusting. I can't believe it," another voice murmured, laced with contempt. Rebecca's heart sank even further. Every word felt like a slap in the face. Ironic, considering the slap she'd just delivered. She had judged Michael in a split second, made assumptions about him based on his skin color, and now she was paying the price. And the worst part was that she deserved every bit of it. A woman sitting near the back, who had been silent until now, sighed deeply and muttered, "It's no wonder people don't trust airlines anymore." Rebecca opened her mouth to speak, but for a moment, nothing came out. She closed her eyes, trying to summon the strength to face him. She started, but the words caught in her throat, her shame paralyzing her. When she finally found her voice, it trembled. "I don't even know where to begin," she whispered, her voice so low it barely carried over the quiet hum of the aircraft. "What I did was wrong. There's no excuse for it. I can't believe I acted like that." Her voice wavered, her guilt pushing her to the edge of tears. "I judged you without even thinking. I judged you because of your skin, because of something that had nothing to do with you, and I struck you." Rebecca finally raised her eyes to meet Michael's, expecting to find anger or hatred there. Instead, she was met with a calm, steady gaze. one that held not just disappointment, but an overwhelming sense of understanding. That look, that calm in his eyes, made the shame swell in her chest until it was almost unbearable. "I wish I could take it back," Rebecca continued, her voice cracking. "I don't know how to make this right. I can't undo what I did, but I need you to know that I am truly, deeply sorry." Michael remained quiet, letting her words hang in the air between them. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was as calm and composed as ever, but there was a weight behind his words. "Rebecca, I appreciate your apology," he said softly, "but you need to understand that words alone don't undo the damage. What happened here, it's not just about me, it's about something bigger, something that people of color face every day." Rebecca's chest tightened with guilt. She nodded quickly, blinking back the tears that blurred her vision. She wanted to speak, to say something to fix the damage she'd caused, but she knew Michael was right. Her apology couldn't erase what she'd done. "I'm not angry," Michael continued, his tone measured. "I'm disappointed in the way this played out. But I hope you take this as an opportunity to learn, to be better." Rebecca's throat tightened as she fought to keep her composure. She nodded, barely able to speak. "I will," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I will." As the whispers spread through the cabin and recognition dawned on the passengers, Michael could feel the subtle shift in the atmosphere. The judgment that had once been directed at him, or worse, at his skin, had now turned toward Rebecca. The weight of their collective condemnation hung heavy in the air, the tension almost palpable. Michael glanced around, his eyes catching the subtle glances, the quick exchanges between passengers. They weren't just shocked by Rebecca's behavior, they were horrified by it. He saw the disgust in their eyes, the way they shifted uncomfortably, as if distancing themselves from the scene, from the racism they had just witnessed. But Michael knew something deeper was happening. These people weren't just condemning Rebecca, they were using her as a scapegoat, an outlet for their own discomfort with the reality of racism. In judging her, they were trying to absolve themselves of any complicity, to convince themselves they were different, that they weren't like her. Michael felt the familiar pang of frustration. He had seen this before. The instinct to pass judgment on an individual act of racism without confronting the larger systemic problem. It was easier to cast blame on one person than to look inward and acknowledge the prejudice that lingered in everyday interactions, even in the most well-meaning of people. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just about a slap, or even about Rebecca's misguided actions. This was an opportunity, an opening to address something bigger, something that ran deeper than the hostility Rebecca had shown him. Michael stood up slowly, the eyes of the cabin following his every movement. As he rose, the whispers hushed, and the tension hung in the air like a thick cloud. Every gaze was on him now, passengers waiting for his reaction, expecting him to lash out, to demand justice for the way he'd been treated. But that wasn't Michael's way. "Ladies and gentlemen," Michael began, his voice calm yet firm, carrying through the quiet cabin. "I know what you're all thinking. You've seen what happened, and you've formed your opinions about it." His eyes scanned the crowd, watching as passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. He could sense their unease, the way they were grappling with their own feelings, some of them angry at Rebecca, others quietly wrestling with their own biases. "What Rebecca did was wrong," he continued, his voice steady. "But before we all rush to judgment, I want us to take a moment to think about why this happened." The cabin remained silent, every passenger hanging on his words. Rebecca stood at the back, her face flushed with shame, her eyes downcast as she listened. Michael could see the weight of her guilt pressing down on her, and he felt a pang of compassion. We live in a world where people are often judged by things they can't control, like the color of their skin or where they come from, Michael said, his gaze sweeping across the cabin. And sometimes we make mistakes. Sometimes we act out of fear or ignorance or assumptions that we don't even realize we're carrying. Rebecca looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise. She had expected anger, expected him to demand punishment, but instead, he was speaking about understanding, about something deeper than her single action. Now, I'm not saying what happened today is acceptable, Michael continued. Racism in any form has no place in our society, and it certainly has no place on this airline. But before we rush to punish Rebecca for what she did, let's remember that real change comes from understanding, from confronting the biases we all carry and choosing to do better. A few passengers nodded, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats as they looked at Rebecca. The anger had softened, replaced by a quiet contemplation. Michael could feel the shift happening, slowly but surely. "I'm not here to destroy someone's career over a mistake," Michael said firmly. "Rebecca made an error in judgment, but we all have to ask ourselves, what would we have done in her shoes? Are we so sure we're free of those same biases?" The cabin was silent, the question hanging heavy in the air. Some passengers avoided his gaze, others looked thoughtful, as though they were seeing the situation through a new lens. Rebecca took a shaky step forward, her eyes brimming with tears as she met Michael's calm, compassionate gaze. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Walker. I don't know what I was thinking. I judged you. I acted out of fear. I should have known better." Michael nodded slowly, acknowledging her words. "You did make a mistake, Rebecca, but this isn't just about you. It's about a system that allows people to make those kinds of assumptions in the first place." Rebecca swallowed hard, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I was scared, but that doesn't excuse what I did. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know, I'll do better. I'll learn." The cabin seemed to collectively exhale, the tension easing slightly as Rebecca's apology hung in the air. But Michael wasn't finished. "I believe you, Rebecca," Michael said softly, "and I'll be advocating for a fair disciplinary process. This isn't about ruining your life. It's about making sure we all learn from this." Rebecca blinked, surprised, as the weight of Michael's words sank in. She had expected harsher consequences, but instead, she was being given a chance to learn, to grow. Michael turned to the rest of the passengers, his voice strong and steady. "This incident highlights a much bigger issue. As the owner of this airline, I'm committed to making sure every one of my employees understands the importance of respect, no matter what someone looks like. And that starts with me." He paused, letting his words sink in. We can't fix racism with punishments alone. We need to confront the culture that allows it to thrive in the first place. And that's what we're going to do, together. The passengers, who had been quiet, now seemed to process Michael's words with a mix of surprise and respect. Some murmured among themselves, others nodded thoughtfully. The hostility that had once been directed at Rebecca had softened, replaced by a deeper understanding of the situation. "Wow," one passenger whispered. "That man has a lot of grace." "He's right," another added. "This isn't just about punishing her. It's about fixing the system." Rebecca, still shaken, wiped her eyes and gave a small, grateful nod in Michael's direction. She had expected wrath, but instead, she had been met with a challenge to do better, to be better. Michael, feeling the shift in the cabin, sat back down. He didn't need to say anything more. His message had been clear. Change begins with understanding, and that was the path they were now on. As the plane hummed with the sound of its engines, the passengers around him slowly returned to their seats, their minds swirling with everything that had just happened. The lesson was clear, and Michael hoped, as they continued their journey, that they would all leave the plane just a little more aware and a little more willing to change.